And I do this for a living, this watching the economy and explaining and trying to interpret it. But I can't remember a month or 2 month period as chock full of explosive transformations in the world economy on a scale of the last 2 months. So it was difficult for me to focus in on what to stress with you tonight, because there really is so much. Let me give you an overview of what I mean by so much. One of the great empires of the world, the British Empire, is in the final months of disintegration. In the last 2 days, the Supreme Court of Scotland explained to the Prime Minister of Great Britain that he was in violation of the law and could not end the meetings of Parliament. I mean, what I just said is staggering. On some levels, the British invented the modern Parliament. And to have reached the point where the only way forward that they can possibly think of is to shut down the elected. Imagine if, well, that isn't so hard, is it? Imagine if Mr. Trump were to tell the senators and the representatives to go home, which is what they're trying to do in England. Basically go home for the period roughly mid-September to mid-October.
He can legally do that.
Yes, well, that's the question. The Supreme Court of Scotland just decided he cannot.
No, Trump can do that.
Yeah, Trump can do it, right? But it's an open question. Mr. Trump clearly has the Supreme Court on his side. For those of you who did not notice, the Supreme Court gave him today, this afternoon, the right basically to deny asylum to refugees, to force them to ask for asylum before they get to the United States, and to arrange to have it denied in Mexico or wherever they might be coming. That was a tough case. They were supposed to not have that go through while it's being appealed. The Supreme Court said the law can apply while it's being appealed, which will deny entry to refugees in a way that really is a major break from much of American, not all of American history, but much of American history in terms of its opening. But let's go back to England. That was once the great empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire. Britannia rules the waves. Or, as the critics said, Britannia waves the rules, or whichever way you like. They waved the rules in order to be able to rule the waves. They're done. They are finished. They are probably finished no matter what happens now. And that is a major end of what was an empire of some several centuries in building itself up and ruling. That is a major change. Here's another one. In many countries of Europe right now, the central banks, and we're talking Germany and other major countries, are so desperate about the recession hitting Europe now. That's a Europe that isn't out of the last capitalist crash of 2008 yet, is now about to be hit by another, that they have taken an extraordinary step of reducing interest rates, hoping that people will borrow cheap money and so buy things or invest in their companies. When that didn't work, they took the next logical step. They now have, for trillions of dollars, negative interest rates. Here's how that works. You take $100 and you give it to the bank. And at the end of the year, they give you back 97. Do you understand? You don't get interest, you pay interest for them to hold your money. Now imagine if you are, this is serious, imagine if you are an older person. Luckily, nobody in this room is an older person. But if you were an older person and you were relying on what you thought were secure savings paying you an interest, you will now face a situation where in your declining years, whatever money you're putting away will shrink every year. So you'll have the lovely experience. The prices will go up and your savings will go down. This is called not good. Or rather, not good for you. It has extraordinary consequences. And yesterday, Mr. Trump, the President of the United States, referring to the Federal Reserve, the most important monetary authority in the United States and in many ways in the world, not only called them, I quote, boneheads. Interesting. He named Mr. Powell the head of the Federal Reserve. The whole collection of them are boneheads. Why? Because they haven't lowered interest rates, including negative interest rates. In Europe, the move to negative interest rates has not overcome or stopped the impending recession. Mr. Trump, choosing carefully what facts he admits into his brain and not, and the people around him likewise, seems not to get that, so he wants to do that here. We'll come back to why he's so desperate about the recession hitting here, which he is. Every time you hear President Trump talk about how great the economy is, please understand, he keeps saying that because it isn't. And that's going to be how you will, I'll go through with you why that shapes what he does. But these are extraordinary steps. Negative interest rates for trillions of dollars, collapse of the British Empire. Couple of others. The United States has been at war in Afghanistan for a long time. Little details for you to think about. The Taliban, the ostensible enemy of the United States, against which the invasion was launched, are now controlling a significantly larger part of Afghanistan than when the United States invaded. Or to say the same thing in plain English, the United States has been defeated in Afghanistan, which every major newspaper in Europe has as a headline, and has already for months. Here in the United States, where you live in a media bubble, this is not made a big thing of. By the way, not just by conservatives and Republicans, but by the good old New York Times as well. But it is a reality. So glaring is that reality that it is dangerous for Mr. Trump's reelection. He may be attacked by the Democrats, particularly if Warren or Sanders are major players, for what? For being the leader at a time of losing a war, not good for election purposes, which is why he came this close to meeting with the Taliban at Camp David 4 or 5 days ago. Mr. Trump's enemies, who don't want that, leaked that information. It got out, and Mr. Trump had to run in the other direction as fast as possible. But not just run in the other direction. Get that off the headlines. Stop letting people come to terms with this un-American fact that we just fought one of the longest, one of the most costly wars in our history, and we were soundly defeated by people much smaller, much less well-armed, and much poorer than we were or are. Not good to run on. And so you had to get the pressure off, and you had to get the headlines off. And how did you do that? 2 things. You told a story, an old story, about some very wonderful made-for-TV dramatic event in which a spy, that's always exciting, in Russia, even more exciting, was miraculously extracted by our noble CIA. I mean, this is, comic books can't do it this way. And it's exciting, and it gets the disaster of that war off the headline. And the second thing that was done, and I don't want anyone here to cry, was to fire Mr. Bolton, because that got him a lot of attention too, and you could have big discussion. Was he fired? Did he resign? Who cares? Even Mrs. Bolton doesn't care. Right? But these are very good because it gets that Taliban disaster off. Folks, these are signs not only of the chaos, but these are signs of the system can't function. It can't function. All right, let's turn then to a few introductory things. That was just to get you kind of in the mood. Big things are happening, somewhat scary, but also the level of change in our society is accelerating. You know, a great political strategist who was asked by his followers many years ago, "Why is everything going so slow?" Gave him this answer. "For decades," he said, "nothing happens. And then in a few weeks, decades happen." You're beginning to move from the first to the second. Things are speeding up, and it's a little hard to keep up with it. All right, so let's begin. First, an item not connected to China, which is our major focus and these big questions, but something that is so powerful, a window into this United States at this point, that I wanted to talk about it. We are in the state of New York, and the state of New York has a governor named Cuomo. And in order to get popular participation in the government, something he spends most of his life trying to avoid, he asked citizens to comment on the design of license plates. Some of you may have noticed this. So if you would like a different color or a different graphic, or I don't know, maybe you'd like a flower on it, or a real flower pressed into it, whatever, or a picture of your grandmother, whatever you might want, he was interested in doing that. So I want to stress to you, here's what he did not ask you to comment on, namely, how are license plates produced? Where and by whom? In case the American public, or at least the New York State public, would have a thought about that, wanting to have some input about something that we're hanging on the back of our cars, if we have one, or there's one on the back of a cab if you use that, or the bus if you ride that, etc. So for those of you who don't know, a little bit of background. License plates are made by prisoners in prisons. Right? So the people who are sent to jail to punish them for whatever crimes they are convicted of are subjected to pressures, I'm trying to be polite here, to work. The going rate in New York's prisons for working and making license plates is 65 cents per hour. I need a moment of silence so that it can sink in. 65 cents an hour. Why is that possible? Since, of course, it violates the law about what minimum wages are, both the federal law, which says the minimum wage you can pay a person is $7.25 an hour, and the state of New York, which has a separate minimum wage, which is a good bit higher than that. But not in jail. There you can pay people 65 cents an hour. Why is that? Because people in jail do not have civil rights in the United States. Why not? Well, they don't even have the right to dispose of their own bodies. Or another way of saying it is, they are slaves. They have masters who can control them, bodily and mind. Why is that possible? Again, for those of you not familiar, the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, a product of the Civil War that was supposed to have freed the slaves, right, with the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment did outlaw slavery, but it included, go read it, it's only 2 sentences long, won't take long. The 13th Amendment. It made one exception to the abolition of slavery. Prisoners. Inmates in prison were not subject to the prohibition on slavery. It was not outlawed. For those of you who don't know, the United States has the highest percentage of its population in prison of any country on this planet. And the overwhelming majority of them are not white. In other words, slavery wasn't abolished, He was moved. And the same people, or at least many of the same people who once were slaves, have their descendants now still slaves to the extent that they are in prison making license plates. Mr. Cuomo did not ask for any comment whatsoever on any of this. He would like your input on decorating the plates, but not on what, of course, matters more. Last point. I don't think you can find, even in this country's conservative population, an article or a book that would make the argument that the rehabilitation or even the punishment of a quote-unquote criminal should include not only being taken out of his or her home, family, community, not being incarcerated in a place where you can't go anywhere unless you have permission, not subject to the pressures, rules, assaults that we all know are part of prison. That's not enough. You have to be made to work for 65 cents an hour and to be treated like a slave. What kind of rehabilitation would you imagine that accomplishes in a person to have their freedom taken away and to be required to live for years as a slave? If you want to know why we have a high rate of recidivism in this country, recidivism is the formal word for people who go finish their sentence, go out into the world, and come back into jail because they run afoul of the law again. Returners. We have a very high rate of recidivism. It might have something to do with treating people as slaves for a long period of time, given what we went through in this country to abolish slavery. It's an extraordinary reality. It is not unique to New York State. There are states that have a worse set of conditions than we do, but we're right up there. So if you thought you lived in a liberal state, not so much, not so much. Okay, next. I'm going to stay with the announced agenda because it'll be so hard to go through these topics. I can't do the normal opening where I give you a half a dozen of these short ones. We don't have the time. We have had some, and we're going to have some more, big nasty hurricanes. You all saw in the recent days what happened to the Bahamas when Dorian went through there. And you're watching our lovely president make sure nobody from the Bahamas comes here. We're helping them there, so they shouldn't come here. That has something maybe to do with the color of the people in Bahama, but we won't go there. We'll leave that alone. We'll pretend we don't notice that. That's not what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about hurricanes and the extraordinary lack of preparation for hurricanes. Every time, by the way, hurricanes, just for those of you that are not into meteorology, hurricanes are not, ready, new. They have been happening for centuries. And it's very convenient. They happen pretty much in the same place. I mean, some variation, but we kind of know where they form, how they blow, and a few miles this way, a few miles that way, sure. And for the people in that path, that's of course very important, but we kind of generally know. Okay? Minnesota doesn't have a lot of them. Florida has a hell of a lot of them, et cetera, et cetera. So we know what they can do, we know how strong they are, we've been through them, we have 8 million documents, films. Why in the world are why are we again suffering houses being destroyed, roads being what? What's going on here? Now the answer is, and it's really important, capitalism's incentive system. And I want to hammer at that because a number of you get told as you go through school, and on behalf of the school I want to apologize, you're told that one of the great virtues of capitalism is that it provides incentives. This is a very deep idea which says if you give someone a reward for doing something, they're more likely to do it. What this has to do with capitalism has always been a mystery to me, but it is used by people because they want to say, for which there's little evidence, that capitalism gives you more of an incentive than every other system gave its people incentives. For those of you who don't know, mathematics was invented long before there was capitalism, and lots of other delicious things that we rely on were invented without capitalism. So why capitalism should get the prize for an incentive, I don't know, but that's not my point, even though I would enjoy spending time on it with you, as you can tell. Here's the problem with incentives. They cut lots of different ways. I'm going to give you a couple of examples having to do with hurricanes. We know perfectly well how to prepare a house, an individual home, an apartment house, anything else, to withstand hurricanes. We know how to do that. We've known how to do that for decades. Here's the problem. The home builder, who knows exactly how to do it, could do it for the houses he or she builds in the path of a hurricane. But here's the problem, you see. It's harder to sell the house to Americans who don't have enough money to buy a house if you equip it with what it needs to have to withstand a hurricane. So the builder, whose job it is not to prepare for hurricanes, but to sell the damn house, preferably at a profit, has no, ready, incentive to jack up the price of that house by doing what would be necessary. And he hopes like hell that the working class family, desperate to have a home of their own, barely able to afford the mortgage for this one, can be convinced into buying that house without looking real closely whether it is protected. You see, capitalism is based on profit, and the profit incentive produces crappy houses not prepared for hurricanes over and over again. So when someone tells you next time about capitalism incentive system, please remember this. Yeah, it has lots of incentives. And for every one that has a nice outcome, I will provide you with one with a hair-raising outcome, such as hurricanes. And the reason I stress this is because, having watched very closely the news reporting in this country about hurricanes, I have never heard any commentator ever make this argument on any radio or television program, which is why I wanted to present it to you. Next item. I can't get through it otherwise. I want to go to this collapse of the British Empire. Not because of the interest it has in itself. And let me take a step back and tell you why you ought to be interested, everyone in this room. What is happening to England is what will happen here. It is our future. We are watching it unfold. Please, long after I'm gone, remember what I just said. It'll help you individually and as a citizen navigate through the disintegration of what you're observing. We are the colony of Great Britain. We are part of that history of that empire. True, we've reversed the roles. From them being the big shot and we being the puny, we have turned it around. But that doesn't mean we're gone from that history. It is our history, a desperate history. When you go, if you read the newspapers tomorrow, you will read about a secret document that was exposed today by a mistake that was made by the Conservative Party. History is full of these mistakes. A secret document prepared by the Conservative Party was exposed just today. And that contains a worst-case scenario for what could happen with Brexit if it happens as it's supposed to on Halloween. Another interesting idea. That's it. 31st of October is the day. By the way, Halloween is a British holiday. It's All Hallows Evening. It's where that comes from. Americans have trouble with foreign words, even if they're English. Anyway, it's Halloween. And this document indicates that the worst case scenario, let me be clear, the worst case scenario of what the British Conservative Party is proposing includes, ready, food riots in the streets, Martial law? That's why I say it's the end. It's the end of this society. When they were exposed, the leader of the government said, well, that's the worst case scenario. That's not our base case. In other words, you are pursuing a policy whose worst case scenario is that? That's not a reason to avoid the policy if that's a possible outcome? What? They got caught. And so now the country is ripped apart. Capitalist interests who think they might get an advantage by being cut off from Europe want it to happen. Capitalist interests that are terrified of what will happen to them if you get cut off from Europe don't want it to happen. The working class is waking up with documents like the one exposed today, realizing that either way, they're screwed. They're screwed if they stay, because that's what they've been happening, being screwed for a long time. If they stay with what was screwing them, chances are it'll continue screwing you. But if they leave, they're for sure screwed. Because there's nothing changing inside British society. The same people will be running it then as running it now. And the British people all know that. They have nowhere to turn. Last point. This last week, for the first time, a sizable and significant group of British capitalists released a document in which they said the following. Brexit, it's called a no-deal Brexit. They don't make an arrangement, they just leave on the 31st of October. That is so dangerous for British society that we have changed our mind. That is the worst thing that can happen. Better for us would be a government led by Jeremy Corbyn. Folks, think. Bernie Sanders is recycling Franklin Roosevelt. The same conditions that made it possible for a Roosevelt to be president for 4 terms is evolving now, and they may also come to the opinion that this guy, weird with that socialism in his name, is less dangerous for us than who? The British capitalists did not hesitate to point the finger. They pointed at Boris Johnson, known in England as the British Trump, and said, he's worse than Corbyn. We're going with Corbyn. And if you follow this in English politics, you'll see that Mr. Corbyn is now being treated more and more by the media as a great statesman. 3 weeks ago, he was a raving leftist lunatic. But whew, how quickly, when a society begins to disintegrate, these kinds of shifts are not at all unusual. But Britain is in the final stages of a reckoning with its own history. It began as a cold, wet, offshore island of Europe, and it is returning to that position, painful as it is, above all for the British, who keep imagining that what has happened to them either hasn't happened or will one day be turned around when another Shakespeare arises. Amazing, amazing what is going on.